Well, here we are again. Good morning. Hope this is a good day for you. And we are continuing our walk with Jesus as we go through the Gospel of Mark. Today we are in Mark chapter 8, and we're looking at just 3 verses, verses 11 through 13. Verses actually that are pretty easy to just kind of gloss over, but we need to look at them closely because something very important is being said here. Jesus, when we last left him last week, we find Jesus at Dalmatia. It was evidently a city on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and so he had landed there, and the Pharisees came out to see him. Now, we're not sure exactly. This could have been the same Pharisees that had come up from Jerusalem to confront him earlier. Maybe it was a different group. We simply don't know for sure. All we do know is that they were not coming out to learn. They were not coming to gain from Jesus what he could give. All they wanted to do was to challenge Jesus. And ultimately, they wanted to destroy him, either to destroy his credibility or his reputation, ultimately destroy him even in his body. These people were bent on destroying who Jesus truly was. And there was the reality here that nothing that Jesus could do would ever really convince them of anything. There were plenty of cases of healings that had already taken place. There were plenty of other miracles to which a number of people had been witnesses, and many people were thus convinced that Jesus was their Messiah. All of these things came into play because there were so many who saw what Jesus did and open-mindedly examined those things and came to the conclusion that he was their Christ. But not these Pharisees. They came out to argue. They were emphasizing something that's actually still true today. An unwilling heart and an unwilling mind cannot be convinced of anything. We see that on all fronts in our world today, and it's still very, very true. So they begin to argue with Jesus. Contrast this with all of those people that we have read about so far, all of those people who came out to Jesus out of their own brokenness, those people who needed healing or they needed a loved one healed. They needed something to take place in their life, and they came out to him because he was their hope. And we see all of these masses of people coming out to Jesus, intrigued by his teaching, willing to be out in the wilderness for all that time, listening to him. And all of those who were responding positively to Jesus, he had demonstrated himself to them in such ways that they found it an undeniable thing that he was the Christ. But these Pharisees came out to argue. Wow. Pride gets in the way of a lot of things, doesn't it? These Pharisees, it says they were seeking a sign from heaven. Now, a couple of different commentaries that I have looked at said that that phrase, sign from heaven, would have been a request for maybe lightning to come down out of heaven or a voice out of heaven, something that would be absolutely undeniable. They needed to see some kind of concrete evidence that Jesus was who he said he was. Now, there had already been concrete evidence of Jesus proving that he was who he said he was, but they were always pushing for something else. We want to see more. We want to see something else. But still, Jesus knew that they would not believe until they were willing to believe. And in verse 12, it says that Jesus was sighing deeply in his spirit. Picture that. It was a deep, heartfelt sigh. It wasn't just a physical sigh, but it was a sign. When we see this coming from his spirit, is this not a sign of Jesus' sadness? Is this not disappointment with people? Is this not even frustration with people? This is an obvious sign of unreturned love. He came to them because he loved them, and they rejected him. And so we find Jesus sighing deeply in his spirit, this deep, sad sigh. And then Jesus asked, why does this generation seek for a sign? Well, obviously, they wanted to see a miracle. They wanted to see this undeniable demonstration of God's power at work in Jesus, ignoring all the other undeniable signs of God's power at work in Jesus. They always wanted something else. When Jesus says, why does this generation seek for a sign, that was not a blanket statement of everybody in that generation, because obviously other people had believed. This was really saying these particular people of this age are looking for this sign or these signs. The fact that Jesus had been setting forth teaching that brought them into the very presence of God was not enough. They wanted some kind of physical demonstration. Kind of like an immature child is not willing to accept a deep, meaningful conversation. They would rather have some silly little thing going on. Now, when I say an immature child, I see a lot of those of all ages, because people are sometimes more interested in seeing some kind of intriguing sign than they are in seeing the truth of the gospel. And so Jesus said, no sign will be given to this generation. He knew that nothing would convince them except maybe one thing. In the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke, the account of this same story adds another phrase, and it says, they say, except for the sign of Jonah. Well, Jesus was pointing them back to the scripture, these Pharisees, pointing them back to the scripture that they already claimed to believe, and they knew the story of Jonah. They knew that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days. They would later find out that Jesus was in the belly of the earth for 3 days. And Jesus was pointing them to the future event of his resurrection. And maybe this resurrection was his sign from heaven. But even then, we know that some of these Pharisees would choose not to believe, even though they saw Jesus alive and then dead and then alive again. They refused to believe. And so we see the very last thing in verse 13, where it says, he left them and went to the other side. This is indeed a sad verse. He went to the other side of Galilee. He got away from these people. He went away from those who were going to choose to not believe. He was going away from those who only wanted to argue. He needed to spend his time with those who would accept his teaching. He needed to spend his time with those who would accept his godness in their presence. And so he left them. I wonder, when Jesus looks at our generation, I wonder how deeply he is sighing in his own spirit. How disappointing it is that so many people are choosing not to believe because they're putting their priorities in so many other places. Oh, Christians, I think we need to think about, are we among those who are willing to believe, or are we among those who just want to argue? God is sighing deeply within his spirit at the results of so many lives. We'll continue this tomorrow. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart words of life, words of hope.